In the first lecture module, I introduced the gnomic covariation theory and discussed some examples from cognitive science which look like they operate in a manner that's at least in the spirit of gnomic covariation. In this module, we want to turn our attention to some of the advantages that are claimed on behalf of gnomic covariation by its advocates. The first advantage that an advocate of gnomic covariation theory might claim has to do with whether or not one finds direct reference accounts of content intuitively compelling. The intuitive appeal of covariation theories on this account stems from the idea that a cognizer represents an object or a property by being causally in tune with that object or property. That is, it provides an explicit linkage between the object or property out in the world and the cognitive state. And if you are attracted to that kind of account as an account of meaning, then you might well find this intuitively appealing. The second kind of argument that an advocate might offer up for gnomic covariation is similar in nature. On this view, covariation approaches provide a clear-cut mechanism through which cognizers can come to know about an object or property in the world through that causal connection. And this links the epistemic and representational capacities of a cognizer. The idea here is that it provides a means by which we can understand representation as reaching out and connecting the cognizer to the world for the purposes of cognition, that is, of coming to know things. The next two advantages claimed for gnomic covariation have specifically to do with the recursive and language-like claims that are often made about mental representation. The first advantage has to do with what Jerry Fodor and others have called punctate or atomic content. The idea behind punctate content is that gnomic covariation fixes the content of individual states in an atomic or isolated fashion. Their content is fixed before they enter into other inferences or get combined into larger representational conglomerate states. As a result, these theories prima facie separate the content of an individual state from the beliefs one might hold or the inferences one might make involving that state. Thus, gnomic covariation on this account is the only theory that can allow for the re-identifying of content across individuals regardless of the beliefs that those individuals have, or that can maintain the same content across dramatic changes in beliefs, or even maintain that content in the face of radically false theories about the thing being represented. To put it a slightly different way, because gnomic covariation focuses only upon that relationship between the object or property in the world and the state that's supposed to represent that object or property, all other variations have no effect upon the content of the belief, and so individuals with dramatically different causal connections in other respects involving those states will nevertheless have content identity precisely because that content identity depends upon only one causal relationship. A fourth advantage that is often claimed on behalf of gnomic covariation by its advocates is the claim that gnomic covariation underwrites the systematicity and compositionality that one observes in the nature of thought. Compositionality is the theory that the meaning of complex expressions in a language results from the meaning of their constitutive components together with the relationships within that complex expression. So, complex meanings are built from simple meanings. Systematicity is simply the claim that that kind of compositionality unfolds in a very systematic way, so that, for example, I can't think of Bill loving Susan without also being, at least in principle, capable of thinking Susan loves Bill. So systematicity and compositionality are features normally thought of in association with language, but since thought underwrites language, thought must have those similar capacities as well. So far, it seems as though a strong case can be made in favor of gnomic covariation as a theory of mental representation. However, there are many challenges that detractors of gnomic covariation will point to that seem to pose serious difficulties for the theory. The first example of that might be the notion of semantic reduction or verificationism. The idea here is that when you look at all the examples that I pointed to from cognitive science, of contents plausibly being assigned to individual states on the basis of those states co-varying with features in the world, those were all basic perceptual features. Edges, the wavelength of light that's getting recorded, the absence or presence of a face, and so on. Detractors of gnomic covariation suggest that those sorts of features are about as high up as you can go, that covariation will likely not explain the representational properties of any but the most primitive representational states. Not surprisingly, covariationists disagree. Covariationists usually respond to this challenge with a two-pronged response. On the one hand, they claim that many more properties, objects, events, and relations can get represented in virtue of gnomic covariation than the skeptic might suppose. On the other hand, they suppose that you can define other concepts like democracy or electron by using the more primitive representational states that gnomic covariation underwrites to define democracy and define electron and so on, so that you get this combination of supposing a higher level of gnomic covariation in the conceptual hierarchy, and then that will get taken over in effect by a kind of verificationist theory of meaning in which all other concepts get defined in terms of the gnomic covariation object language. The next kind of objection that gets offered up against gnomic covariation points to the fact that non-existent objects, in virtue of their lack of existence, cannot causally covary with mental states, and yet we seem perfectly capable of representing things that don't exist. We have a concept of unicorn, and that concept seems to be meaningful, seems to represent something, despite the fact that there are no unicorns to cause that state. Similarly, motor commands are the causes of their content. So my motor command that directs my hand to pick up my glass of water, that isn't caused by my hand picking up that glass of water. It is the cause of my hand picking it up. And hence, there is no gnomic covariation of my hand picking up that glass causing the state. The causal chain goes in the opposite direction. And this too seems to pose a problem for gnomic covariation. The final challenge we'll consider in this lecture module has to do with absent qualia. Covariation seems to relate states to features, objects, events, and relations in the world in a manner that doesn't have any bearing upon our ability to access those representational contents consciously. Hence, some critics of gnomic covariation point to this feature of covariation and argue that covariation appears to bestow content absent conscious access to content, and hence it fails to give or guarantee conscious access to the contents of representational states. In the next lecture module, we'll turn our attention to the most talked about objection in the literature, that of the disjunction problem.